odd titles, had waited round the corner after dark, and tempted Miggs the incorruptible with golden guineas to deliver offers of marriage folded up in love letters. How many disconsolate fathers and substantial tradesmen had waited on the locksmith for the same purpose, with dismal tales of how their sons had lost their appetites, and taken to shut themselves up in dark bedrooms, and wandering in desolate suburbs with pale faces, and all because of Dolly Varden's loveliness and cruelty! How many young men, in all previous times of unprecedented steadiness, had turned suddenly wild and wicked for the same reason, and in an ecstasy of unrequited love taken to wrench off door-knockers and invert the boxes of rheumatic watchmen! How had she recruited the king's service, both by sea and land, through rendering desperate his loving subjects between the ages of 18 and 25! How many young ladies had publicly professed, with tears in their eyes, that for their tastes she was much too short, too tall, too bold, too cold, too stout, too thin, too fair, too dark, too everything but handsome! How many old ladies, taking counsel together, had thanked Heaven their daughters were not like her, and had hoped she might come to no harm, and had thought she would come to no good, and had wondered what people saw in her, and had arrived at the conclusion that she was going off in her looks, or had never come on in them, and that she was a thorough imposition and a popular mistake. And yet here was this same Dolly Varden, so whimsical and hard to please that she was Dolly Varden still, all smiles and dimples and pleasant looks, and caring no more for the 50 or 60 young fellows who at the very moment were breaking their hearts to marry her, than if so many oysters had been crossed in love and opened afterwards. Dolly hugged her father, as has been already stated, and having hugged her mother also, accompanied both into the little parlour, where the cloth was already laid for dinner, and where Miss Miggs, a trifle more rigid and bony than of yore, received her with a sort of hysterical gasp, intended for a smile. Into the hands of that young virgin she delivered her bonnet and walking dress, all of a dreadful, artful, and designing kind, and then said with a laugh which rivalled the locksmith's music, "How glad I always am to be at home again!" "And how glad we always are, Doll," said her father, putting back the dark hair from her sparkling eyes, "to have you at home. Give me a kiss." If there had been anybody of the male kind there to see her do it, but there was not, it was a mercy. "I don't like your being at the Warren," said the locksmith. "I can't bear to have you out of my sight. And what is the news over yonder, Doll?" "What news there is, I think you know already," replied his daughter. "I am sure you do, though." "Aye!" cried the locksmith. "What's that?" "Oh, come, come," said Dolly. "You know very well. I want you to tell me why Mr Haredale, oh, how gruff he is again, to be sure, has been away from home for some days past, and why he is travelling about. We know he is travelling, because of his letters, without telling his own niece why or wherefore." "Miss Emma doesn't want to know, I'll swear," returned the locksmith. "I don't know that," said Dolly, "but I do at any rate. Do tell me, why is he so secret, and what is this ghost story which nobody is to tell Miss Emma, and which seems to be mixed up with his going away? Now I see you know, by your colouring so." "What the story means, or is, or has to do with it, I know no more than you, my dear," returned the locksmith, "except that it's some foolish fear of little Solomon's, which has indeed no meaning in it, I suppose. As to Mr Haredale's journey, he goes, as I believe—" "Yes," said Dolly. "As I believe," resumed the locksmith, pinching her cheek, "on business, Doll. What it may be is quite another matter. Read Blue Beard, and don't be too curious, pet. It's no business of yours or mine, depend upon that, and here's dinner, which is much more to the purpose." Dolly might have remonstrated against this summary dismissal of the subject, notwithstanding the appearance of dinner, but at the mention of Bluebeard, Mrs Varden interposed, protesting she could not find it in her conscience to sit tamely by and hear her child recommended to peruse the adventures of a Turk and Mussulman, far less of a fabulous Turk, which she considered that potentate to be. She held that, in such stirring and tremendous times as those in which they lived, it would be much more to the purpose if Dolly became a regular subscriber to the Thunderer, where she would have an opportunity of reading Lord George Gordon's speeches word for word, which would be a greater comfort and solace to her than 150 Bluebeards ever could impart. She appealed in support of this proposition to Miss Miggs, then in waiting, who said that indeed the peace of mind she had derived from the perusal of that paper generally, but especially one article of the very last week as ever was, entitled Great Britain Drenched in Gore, exceeded all belief. The same composition, she added, had also wrought such a comforting effect on the mind of a married sister of hers, then resident at Golden Lion Court, number 27, second bell handle on the right-hand door-post, that, being in a delicate state of health, and in fact expecting an addition to her family, she had been seized with fits directly after its perusal, and had raved of the Inquisition ever since, to the great improvement of her husband and friends. Miss Miggs went on to say that she would recommend all those whose hearts were hardened to hear Lord George themselves, whom she commended first, in respect of his steady Protestantism, then of his oratory, then of his eyes, then of his nose, then of his legs, and lastly of his figure generally, which she looked upon as fit for any statue, prince, or angel, to which sentiment Mrs Varden fully subscribed. Mrs Varden having cut in, looked at a box upon the mantel-shelf, painted in imitation of a very red brick dwelling-house, with a yellow roof, having at top a real chimney, down which voluntary subscribers dropped their silver, gold, or pence into the parlour, and on the door the counterfeit presentment of a brass plate, whereon was legibly inscribed Protestant Association, and looking at it, said that it was to her a source of poignant misery to think that Varden never had, of all his substance, dropped anything into that temple, save once in secret, as she afterwards discovered, 2 fragments of tobacco pipe, which she hoped would not be put down to his last account. That Dolly, she was grieved to say, was no less backward in her contributions, better loving, as it seemed, to purchase ribbons and such gauds than to encourage the great cause then in such heavy tribulation, and that she did entreat her father she much feared could not be moved, not to despise, but imitate the bright example of Miss Miggs, who flung her wages, as it were, into the very countenance of the Pope, and bruised his features with her quarter's money.
"Oh, Mim," said Miggs, "don't allude to that. I'd no intentions, Mim, that nobody should know. Such sacrifices as I can make are quite a widow's mite. It's all I have," cried Miggs, with a great burst of tears, for with her they never came on by degrees. "But it's made up to be in other ways. It's well made up." This was quite true, though not perhaps in the sense that Miggs intended, as she never failed to keep her self-denial full in Mrs Varden's view. It drew forth so many gifts of caps and gowns and other articles of dress, that upon the whole the red brick house was perhaps the best investment for her small capital she could possibly have hit upon, returning her interest at the rate of 7 or 8 per cent in money, and 50 at least in personal repute and credit. "You needn't cry, Miggs," said Mrs Varden, herself in tears. "You needn't be ashamed of it, though your poor mistress is on the same side." Miggs howled at this remark in a peculiarly dismal way, and said she knowed that master hated her, that it was a dreadful thing to live in families and have dislikes, and not give satisfactions, that to make divisions was a thing she could not abear to think of, neither could her feelings let her do it, that if it was master's wishes as she and him should part, it was best they should part, and she hoped he might be the happier for it, and always wished him well, and that he might find somebody as would meet his dispositions. It would be a hard trial, she said, to part from such a missus, but she could meet any suffering when her conscience told her she was in the rights, and therefore she was willing even to go that lengths.
She did not think, she added, that she could long survive the separations, but, as she was hated and looked upon unpleasant, perhaps her dying as soon as possible